Council to engaging the whole community in conversations about shaping the future of the district through its local plan. At the heart of this approach is an open public consultation which takes place over several months rather than the usual weeks. The plan itself has been broken down into smaller topics which can be more easily debated and commented upon. Every couple of weeks, this forum meets for a presentation on a particular topic. The forum is made up of people who represent different interest areas across the region, and I'll let those people introduce themselves as we move through the discussion. It cannot represent every interest area or every group of residents. The forum debate that follows each presentation is designed to stimulate the public debate and consultation that follows, and it's really important to note that the public consultation is the most important element of this process. It's really vital that all stakeholders contribute to the debate. Please, everybody, use your networks of contacts to share the forum presentations and to encourage participation and comment, especially to involve members of the community who may not otherwise make their voices heard. If you go to the UDC website and search the new local plan, you'll find various buttons that allow you to submit your views under each topic. At the end of this consultation period, Uttlesford District Council will consider all the representations received during the consultation and consider them when drafting the local plan. So to be clear, this group is independent of the council, it is not a decision-making body, and its members' views will not override those contributed by the wider community throughout the public consultation. Participants have been made to ask contributions from the perspective of their special interest area rather than to advance any personal or professional agenda, such as in relation to their place of residence or the interests of a specific organisation. So now we're going to turn to this evening's meeting. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight, people on the panel and also people watching from home. Or I guess we're all at home, but you know what I mean, on the webinar. So today our meeting is about transport, and we're very grateful to Andrew Summers for joining us. And I'd like to hand over to him now for the presentation. Before he starts, I'd just like to mention that there is a question and answer function, and anybody, even looking on the webinar, are invited to submit questions, and you are able to upvote the questions, and towards the end of the discussion we will endeavour to ask 2 or 3 of the most popular ones. So if you can see your question already there, please upvote the question rather than writing it out again. And the chat function, by the way, is disabled. Andrew, thank you very much. Over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Angela, and good evening, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, so I'll be a few seconds whilst I do that. Okay, you should all now see the presentation that I'm going to be talking through. Angela, can I just confirm that you can all see that okay now? Excellent. Many thanks. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Andrew Summers. I'm Strategic Director of Transport East. I'm going to talk to you this evening about the role of transport in the East of England and hopefully bring you some insights from some of the work that we've been completing over the last few months with partners from Uttlesford and across the region on our wider transport strategy. My first slide here, I'm just going to give you a very quick introduction to Transport East. I'm not sure how many of you will be aware of us, but we are one of 7 subnational transport bodies across England. The government has outlined their aspiration for subnational areas to come forward with clear strategic approach for transport and a set of priorities. And Transport East, covering Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, Southend and Thurrock, is one of those 7 subnational transport bodies. We are a partnership, so we're comprised of the 5 transport authorities, Essex being the one in this part of the world, 24 district authorities, including Uttlesford, who is a member of Transport East, our 2 LEPs, local enterprise partnerships, 3 chambers of commerce, including Essex Chamber of Commerce, Highways England, Network Rail and DfT. Our role is to develop a transport strategy to 2050 that sets out the aspirations of all of those partners and sets to government what are our investment priorities over that period of time to make sure that we get the transport system that we need to achieve our outcomes. We speak with one voice for our subnational area on transport, and we help to accelerate and improve the delivery of transport mechanisms. As Strategic Director, I joined the organisation as the first member of staff back in April last year. And as a body, we've been up and coming and making sure that we have a strategy in place, and we're aiming to go out to public consultation on our strategy later in 2021. What I'm going to present today are some of the findings from those discussions we've had with partners over the last couple of months that have really given some insights into some of the things that local people are thinking, that bodies across the region are thinking, that national government are thinking. And I'm really hopeful that some of those insights will be helpful for your discussions in Uttlesford, because I think there's a lot of alignment between the various objectives. So how did we start off the piece of work that we've done over the last couple of months to really understand what is it we're trying to achieve from transport? We've had a very strong look at what those central government priorities are. And this slide here represents in word format what are the big themes that national government cares about with regards to transport right now. The bigger the word, the greater the number of times it appears in a national transport strategy document. Decarbonisation and climate action, it has really come up over the last couple of years as a key priority for central government. This has been set out both in the Department for Transport's plan for decarbonisation, I'll come on to that a bit later on, and more generally including the work that Number 10 have been doing on it as well. So for us going forwards, decarbonisation is absolutely crucial. Some other key themes are coming through here at a national level. So economic growth and jobs, particularly as we come out of COVID over the next few years. What is it that we do to support that economic growth? And levelling up as well. This has been a term coined by central government over the last few years with a focus on the north of England, but really from our part of the world, we need to have a perspective on what that means for our local plans and transport strategies, as well as public health. Obviously, COVID-19 has brought that to the centre of our attention, but what do we need to do from a transport perspective to make sure that our populations are healthy going forwards? So at a national level, these are the types of things that are really coming through strongly. Now, we've compared those against priorities for local levels. So we've spoken to all 24 districts across the east of England, including Uttlesford, the local enterprise partnerships, the Chamber of Commerce, and what is coming through their strategies. Some similar themes, so climate action. A number of local authorities have set climate emergencies, but there's much more of a place and local feel here. So local jobs, local development, housing a really important issue for local people, as well as some of those demographics around the population. So a real sense here that we've got these national level objectives around levelling up, around economy, around decarbonisation, but then at a local level, there's much more of a sort of a place-based approach that people care about in terms of jobs, local development, housing, etc. And we need to be aware of these two and any tensions between them as we develop our transport strategy. So the early work we've done on our transport strategy has been to identify what are those wider outcomes that we want to achieve through transport. It's worth remembering that transport is an enabler to wider outcomes. It's not a goal in itself. And we need to be really clear about what it is we're trying to achieve. And that goes for national level strategies. It goes for subnational that I'm doing at the minute, and also for local level. Now, at a Transport East level, the outcomes on the left-hand side are those which our local partners have come up with as those outcomes we really need to achieve. They are reducing carbon emissions from transport, promoting and supporting that diverse economy, enhancing the built environment, supporting locally important growth areas, and a real emphasis here on rural, urban, and coastal and the distinctiveness between them. Promoting active, healthy lifestyles, supporting our energy sector, and skills attainment, retention, and social inclusion. And all of these need to be in focus as we develop our transport strategy. The remainder of my presentation is going to go through those in a bit more detail, but on the right-hand side here, what we have are those four key themes from a Transport East perspective that wrap all of those up. Decarbonisation is fundamental to our future transport strategy. Global gateways for the east of England. We have 13 ports and 3 airports, a significant amount of transport implications arising from those, a lot of economic growth associated with them. They need to be front and centre as we're thinking about what is our transport strategy going forwards. Multi-centred growth as well. We have 2 cities and 76 large or medium-sized towns. We have quite a polycentric settlement pattern. We need to be working out how do we connect those towns and cities, including to Cambridge, including to London as well, outside of our region. And what is it that we need to ensure that connectivity between them is world class. And then Last on the list, but certainly not last in terms of priority, are energising those coastal and rural communities. I think it's felt that in this part of the world, a lot of the transport challenges arising are those associated with the rurality of the region. And this isn't as high up on the government agenda as we'd like it to be. So we're really focused on making sure that this comes across in our strategy as we bid to government for future funding. So in the sort of the final part of my presentation, I'm just going to go through each of those themes in more detail, because I'm really hoping that these provide some of the issues that you might want to talk about in the discussion session. So addressing the causes and impacts of climatic change. So this is significant for transport. Government has published its 10-point decarbonisation plan. In the east of England, we published a study in November that showed that transport is the largest contributor of CO2 in the east of England. 41% of all emissions. It's a significant issue for us. And again, we are one of those regions that stands to be most impacted by things such as sea level rise, if some of those worst impacts occur over the next 40 to 50 years. So we need to be thinking, what is our strategy for that? The work that we've done so far is pointed towards three broad areas: mode shift away from the private car to more sustainable modes, the development of alternative fuels, what is the role of electric and hydrogen in terms of powering our cars going forwards, and then reducing the need to travel overall, so the enhanced role of digital technology, automation, etc. How much does Uttlesford want to dial up and dial down on those three types of policy measures? And a really interesting topic to discover later on. In terms of promoting and supporting a diverse economy, one of the main case for investment that we put forward to central government is the role that our region plays in that wider UK economy, a £73 billion economy that we have here. But one of the key issues that our stakeholders have identified is the poor connectivity, particularly east-west. So if you think of some of the connections from here to those western or eastern parts of the country, quite poor, I guess, compared to some of those north-south routes. But again, those north-south routes really need to be supported going forwards. And thinking again in this example, things such as the West Anglian Main Line, absolutely fundamental. As well as those longer distance trips, it's working out what are those first mile, last mile options and reducing that high car dependency. So can we develop a future economy based on more sustainable transport going forward? Again, a key theme that we need to be tackling as we go forward. And then you focus more on locally important centres, so rural, urban and coastal. Now, across the region, we're predicted to grow by about 300,000 new homes in the next 15 years, significant. And the way we deliver that is going to impact significantly on how our transport system is going to react. And we need to plan both the planning and the housing and transport together in order to make sure it's successful. Now, a number of considerations here. Is that growth clustered or dispersed? Clustered growth obviously supports more sorts of mode shift. Dispersed, what might point towards a decarbonisation strategy more around electric vehicles. So some very different outcomes in terms of transport, depending on the types of growth. Mode shift needs to be considered here. Quality of life, so air quality and safety, key transport indicators that need to be considered in terms of those locally important centres, as well as that government objective of levelling up. And we need to try to understand what is our version of levelling up in the east of England and in Uttlesford. I'm just going through some of the final outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So supporting skills attainment, retention and social inclusion. As we've spoken to partners, we've spoken to a number of businesses, and they're particularly concerned around the younger generation in terms of access by younger people to skills, to training, to new job opportunities, particularly post-COVID, if there's a greater working at home environment, not as conducive to young people learning how to develop in the workplace and also how to access the workplace by non-car means. This is a key thing that our partners are quite concerned about, and obviously one of the things that we'd probably advise Uttlesford to consider as they're developing the transport strategy and approach. In terms of promoting active and healthy lifestyles, obviously this has taken an increased emphasis following the recent pandemic, the ability of people to lead healthy lifestyles. Active travel is one of the easiest ways that people can get physical activity. Public Health England advocates that everyone does 20 minutes of physical activity a day. Walking is the easiest way to do that. Cycling as well, increasingly popular option for doing that. If we invest in walking and cycling facilities where it's viable, you can have a really positive impact on reducing the health costs, the risks of key diseases such as heart and circulatory disease, and the risk of early death. The key barrier to cycling is the perception of safety. A number of surveys taken place across the UK outlining that one of the main reasons people don't cycle or walk is the perception of it's unsafe, the lack of segregated routes, or the lack of off-road provision. And so one of the things that government have done in this area over the last year is to develop their gear change strategy, which advocates a doubling of walking and cycling over the next 5 years, with 2 billion available to local authorities to bid for. Now, it might be one of the things that we're thinking about here. How do we start to invest more in walking and cycling, and how do we interact with that government policy and that funding pot to allow us to increase the number of people that are able to walk and cycle? Supporting the energy sector is a unique theme for the East of England. It's probably more directed towards the coast. But over the next 20, 30 years, we are going to be the biggest providing region of electricity in the UK, an exporter, and we need to use that to our strength. And one of the ways in which the Transport East Forum really wants to take this forward is using this status to shift the debate to make sure that we are that exemplar region in zero carbon vehicles. By 2030, the government is going to pause and stop all sale of petrol and diesel cars. So we've got about a decade to work out what do we do as a solution to that. And it feels that for a lot of trips that take place in rural areas, it might be electric vehicles, alternative fuel cars that provide some of the answer, but the infrastructure needs to be in place to support that, both in people's homes and also in the destinations that they're going to. I won't dwell too much on this slide, but it goes without saying that protecting and enhancing the built and natural environment is a key priority as well. A number of protected areas across the east of England, and we need to be mindful of this as we develop our transport priorities to ensure we're continuing to enhance those areas that we have across the east of England region. And then this is the final slide in terms of theme. So not an outcome, but the increased use of digital connectivity as an enabler of all of these outcomes. So we've thought of transport traditionally in the past as roads, as rail, as walking, as cycling. Increasingly, I think over the last 10 months, we've seen that we can access services, we can work from home, we can shop, we can do other activities by good digital connectivity, and an increased awareness and acceptance of this as a practice going forward. So one of the key considerations here is this a part of your strategy going forward? And if so, how much? And what do you need to do to support that? So super fast broadband, 5G in rural areas, for example, how much does that play a part in your strategy? Because it does feel from speaking to partners that increasingly this could be part of the solution that we're looking at going forwards. So, Angela, that concludes the presentation. Hopefully it gives a bit of food for thought for colleagues here to be able to talk through now. I've got, after this, the generic slide that you've provided in terms of the questions. Angela, I'll hand over to you to sort of take over from now. I'm happy to answer any questions now or move forward to that slide that we've got around the wider discussion. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much. Do you want to put the slide up now, Andrew, and we'll just have a look at that. I think everyone should have seen this. I think this was on the website. So everyone wants to have a quick look at that now. And in a moment, what we'll do, while you're taking that in, I will just say that this week, for the first week, we have another agenda item to fit in, which is the summary of the very first discussion we had, theme 1, where you live. And we need to try and get that in alongside all the discussion and the public questions that we normally have. So I'm not going to do what I normally do with the panel, which is go around individually and ask everybody for a comment or question. I'm just going to ask everybody to use the raise hand function at the bottom if they would like to make a comment or ask a question, on the basis that some people might not. Now, the issue is that transport, as we've said many times on this forum, does run through everything. So I'm expecting that possibly everybody will put their hand up, and that's fine. But if I can't get to you, apologies, because I'm on a tight time schedule. Do feel free, panel members, as you should every week, to go to the UDC website and submit your comments and questions and thoughts there. as those will all be taken into consideration. But Andrew's been incredibly efficient, and we may have time to get through everybody anyway. So thank you very much, Andrew. So I think if we go back to not sharing this slide and go back to the view of everybody, I'll start the discussion that way.
Yeah, so I've stopped sharing the screen now. Hopefully it should be back.
Yes, good. And we don't have as many people, I think, today as we often do, so we may well get through everybody. But I'm actually going to, I think it was Edward last week or last time we were all together, who coined the phrase playing my Joker. So this week Anthony is playing his Joker because he is transport. So Anthony, would you like to kick us off? I'm going to give you slightly longer as this is your topic, but I, as mentioned, I will need to stop you eventually so we can get everybody else in.
Oh, I don't think you'll have to stop.
Okay.
Well, thank you. That was an interesting presentation, and it just shows the way things have changed over the last 10, 15 years, and the way we are expecting them to change within 10 years, and subsequently, as time goes on, the way things must change. One's got to just look at that spurt, which we are concerned with as a district before taking matters very much further. Bear in mind, first of all, that it is the largest of the districts in the home counties, and that if one works out in terms of numbers of population, we have in this district only 1/4 of size population compared with the whole of Essex. Now that is quite a tremendous difference. In fact, it's half the numbers for the whole of England. So we've got to consider it in these sort of terms. Admittedly, we have our towns, not many, and we have a large area of countryside. So in those circumstances, although generally speaking, what we're coming to at the end of the day is an increase in housing, it is a question of how we get there and the way we go about it. Now, the county accepts that in this district there are accessibility issues because large numbers of the villages are without private transport, they have no public transport, and therefore in the circumstances there is no option for anybody who lives there but to have a car or have some other means of getting about. Now, the speaker mentioned particularly the concept of where we go from here at this point in time. We are, of course, in this rather odd situation of a pandemic, very odd. But it is we now understand how we live on our own. And the question is, do we want to continue to live in this sort of way, or are we going to go back to our old ways? And I would have thought more likely than not it would be the latter, in which case broaden your concerns to the situation that existed a year ago as opposed to now. I won't go into the extent to which it's necessary for there to be a lot of transport in this area, other than to say that because of the sort of population that is in the area, large numbers leave it to go to work, and large numbers come into it to go to work. Transport is a necessity. And in those circumstances, propositions which would change that really have got to be considered very carefully indeed. In framing your response, I would have liked you particularly to consider the extent to which your interest or view has on the general public, because it is in transport more than any other that you see and contact the general public. Think of their needs as much as yours. If you look at things in the way that you want to see things now, then in those circumstances, you may well find that in 4 or 5 years' time, you have changed your needs. So think of it in those sort of terms. Can you live under the restrictions that you may impose upon yourself and others now. This is a matter of concern. That's it, Angela. Thank you.
Anthony, thank you very much. Thanks for that. I should also say that what I'll do is I'll take two or three people's comments before I ask Andrew to come back on any of it, just to help us with time again. One other quick thing is just to say that people watching who aren't on the panel, the raise hand function is not for you, it is just for the panel members. If people watching on the webinar want to get involved, please go onto the Q&A function and either post a question or upvote one of the questions that's already there. Samantha, you have your hand up. Would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. My role is to represent diversity on this panel, and to me that means various things such as people who are single mothers or single parents, disabled people, BAME people, elderly people, and youth. So it's anyone affected by diversity strands. So my thinking is that currently, as you referred to the lessened use of public transport, for instance, during COVID, what effect is that going to have on keeping services going? Because in rural scenarios, we see that there are reduced bus services anyway because they're considered to be not commercially viable, and trains also perhaps will have a reduced service. I'm not sure how, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but that's what I fear might happen because there is less usage of public transport. You've also referred to the new reliance on technology. We've realized what is possible, and we know now that we can do a lot of the work that is done in Britain in this economy by doing things online. So I just wondered, and this is a key consideration, the affordability. If prices are going up, that would be unaffordable for many disadvantaged people who still have to make their way to their workplace and may not be able to afford transport. So you've referred to electric cars, and I know that they are really, really expensive. So I think affordability is a key question. Public transport would be viable if it wasn't so tied into being commercially viable. If it was a public service, then maybe that would be viable. There are also other ideas like carpooling. So if we had electric cars, I know that's been mentioned by other people on other presentations, but carpooling or some way of sharing the expense of having electric cars would be really viable. And I heard your mention of the figure of 41% of emissions being due from transport in the east of England. I think the figure for Uttlesford or in our rural areas is 75%, which is a stunningly high figure. So we do need to reduce that. We can't just say that we need car usage to continue. And as you say, 2030 is when fossil fuel vehicles will be not be able to be sold. I hope they won't be able to be used either. So that's the affordability question. The other thing you mentioned is connectedness to airports and villages, which are key sites of employment at the moment, or even for travel. So we find that in our village, we can't get to the airport after certain times by train because the train just doesn't go there. So connectivity, and as you say, also going to other places in the country truly isn't viable by train. So if we want to go north often or west, it isn't really possible without going into London first, which adds a lot of time to people who are working and who need to go to those areas. So that's really difficult. So connectivity would be great. And also electrifying all the rails in the country would be great too. So the other point you made about cycling, also think that's really great because it is affordable. Where I live, it's difficult to cycle around because the fear factor, yes, and also the roads are really narrow. So connecting to places like my village to go to Saffron Walden, say, is really difficult, I think, and there is no cycle route. And yes, I would fear it. I love cycling, but I wouldn't do that journey. And I know that other parents who send their children to school would be reluctant to let them cycle. Some of them do because they actually come to harm. So I think it's a legitimate concern, and we do need to address that, safely cycling, because it would be a lovely thing to do. I do think so, but just the constraints of our roads and rivers and where everything.
I'm going to have to cut in because I'm on my tight time.
Yeah.
If you have time at the end, I'll come. If you had any more points, I'll come back if we get the chance. But there's so much in what you and Anthony said. I'm just going to let Andrew jump in and address a few of those points.
Yeah, no, thanks. Great questions, both. And a couple of themes come out there, I think, particularly around understanding the future. And are we going to go back to normal, or are things going to change? And I think, Samantha, you started to highlight some of those things that we would want to change as we go forwards. Just sort of wrapping that up, I guess, there's probably some things that will stick, but then some things that will change. So probably covering both of those. In terms of things that are stick, certainly the work we've done so far with our public surveys are showing that there is an appetite for greater working at home, and things may go back for those that can work at home, for doing something like, a couple of days a week, but then working at home more for 3 days, working in a workplace for 3 days a week, or some sort of balance. But it's worth recognising that not everyone, and a huge amount of people actually can't work at home, and still have to access employment sites, be that private sector, be that hospitals, etc. And so the transport requirements for them will remain, and as things get back to normal, there will be an increased demand again for public transport and road use. I think one of the issues is around passenger transport viability going forwards. I think you've both picked that up, and I think that's crucial, something that Transport East is looking at. Speaking with some of the rail operating companies, they're not expecting things to return to normal until about 2023, 2024 in terms of demand, similar for some of the sort of the aviation as well. But once we've got to that point, I think a sense that we do need to be continuing to provide capacity. But that presents a problem, particularly for passenger transport. And I think, Samantha, you identified the model that we have at the minute in this country outside of London for particularly bus provision does not work. It was put into place in the 1940s, and it just is not fit for purpose, and DfT have recognised that. They are producing a new national bus strategy, and part of the work that we're looking at Transport East is what is it that we need to do in terms of that passenger transport to improve things going forwards. Now, a useful way to think about this, particularly for rural areas, is a piece of work that Midlands Connect have done, and I'll refer you to a study they've done called their Rural Mobility Study. So Midlands Connect is the equivalent region to us, but for the Midlands, and they've done a piece of work that's basically identified 3 core areas where you need to be thinking about. One is continuing to get people to places in rural areas, but the other 2 are how can you get places to people more? So actually developing in your own places things such as hubs, things such as feeder services that come into those sort of central hubs, so that within a place, within a local area, you can access more of those services that you need. And then the third area they've been looking at is what we've been talking around digital connectivity, so replacing transport with online services, with working from home, etc. And their report sets out quite a useful framework for thinking about this. And there's a bit of each that we need to be developing. But I think going back to the public transport issue, there's definitely a concern there. One of the things we're looking at in our strategy is what is that better model of provision in regions such as this, where it's just economically unviable to continue as we are, and indeed many operators are at risk of going out of business over the next few months anyway, because of the lack of capacity on passenger transport and the lack of revenue that they're getting. So I think you've hit the nail on the head in what the issues are there, and it's working out what is that package of solutions. And I think that study I talked about provides some useful clues there.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That's really helpful. Richard, I think you were the next person with your hand up. You're on mute, Richard.
Right, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Just a couple of points for Andrew. The first is, I mean, I'm convinced that commuting will come back, simply because most of the larger employers who occupy these office buildings in London and Canary Wharf, they've got 10, 15-year leases on those, and they've got to find something to do with them. So there's that aspect. The other thing is that I'm hearing from professional firms, from bankers, that actually productivity goes down dramatically when all their staff are working from home. So I think there is going to be a move back to commuting. So with that in mind, and given the sort of rurality of the Uttlesford district, I think the issue is that there isn't the connection available to the sort of the transport hubs, to the stations particularly. And one of the real problems is that we're having dumped upon us large housing developments, which are inevitably going to have to go into rural or semi-rural areas. But the transport links to those hubs are not being funded by the developers. And I just wonder whether whether Andrew has got any plans to introduce greater contributions from Section 106 or SIL towards the provision of transport links, because I mean, even things like the Cambridge guided bus, I mean, there was very, very little developer funding for that. And I mean, it just seems entirely wrong that housing that creates the need isn't actually providing the cost or the money towards the infrastructure. That's point one. And then the other point is quite simply with regard to electric vehicles. When I was working, I was driving very often 300-400 miles in a day. By current standards of electric cars, I would have probably had to make 4 or 5 stops on those journeys just to recharge. It's entirely impractical. So I just wonder whether Andrew's got any information for us on battery capacity for the future. It's all very well to buy a Tesla for £100,000, but even that will only do 200 miles. So I just wonder whether Andrew's got any information he could give us with regard to the charging capacity of electric vehicles for the future.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'm just going to take one more person, if you can file all that away, Andrew, and I'll come back to you after the next person. Alison, you messaged me to say you've got some comments. And Alison, you represent the voluntary sector. So I didn't catch you beforehand to ask you to put it on your screen. So.
Oh, sorry, okay. I was a little bit late, sorry. I just wanted to flag up for kind of advocating for people that we tend to be working with in the voluntary sector, that people couldn't access services very well before COVID, and they still can't access services very well during COVID. And we need to look after them post-COVID, because people quite often are living in places that are quite outside of town centres and quite often struggle to access services, and they often don't have cars, and we haven't got the public transport. So I know we're all aware of that already, but I just want to flag that up. We're not just talking about the working population or the population that have income and all of those things. And the other thing that's been really interesting for us is about digital connectivity. So yeah, we're working great with digital, and there's lots of innovative stuff going on, but and you know, goodness knows I've dropped out of so many meetings today and back in and all that stuff. We definitely need better connectivity in this area. However, we offer that as a default. So I work for Mind. We offer that as a default for our interventions, and most of the people coming to us don't have the internet. So it's not about whether it's good internet or bad internet. They literally don't have the internet, and then they don't have any kit. So actually people haven't got the equipment, so we need to include that in the mix. We can't just say we need good tech, we need good connectivity and assume that that's going to make it happen. But what I would say is that when we can get people doing interventions online like this or one-to-one, it does actually work really well. So it's not a good option. It's like an option that's not accessible to people. So I think we should bear that in our plans, really.
Thanks very much, Alison. Do you want to come back about both of those comments, Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, on Richard's point about commuting, I guess there's breaking that down, it's 2 legs of the journey, really, I guess, from here. There's that connection to the station, and then there's, I guess, presumably the West Anglia Main Line being the predominant commuting route into London. And both of those need attention, I think. On the West Anglia Main Line, I was at the All-Party Parliamentary Group on that a few weeks ago. And one of the things I would suggest that this part of the world really needs to do is keep the pressure on Network Rail and government to continue with the capacity enhancements on there, to make sure that provides the service that you need. And then, as Richard, you said, the other leg of that journey is in how you connect from the station to rural areas. And I think, as you rightly identified, if you build your houses nearer to the station, it makes it so much easier to do so than if you disperse those houses in rural areas where you're really only giving the people the opportunity to make that journey by private car. So I guess the nature of that housing development is fundamentally linked to the type of transport provision that you would eventually be able to provide. In terms, you mentioned funding as well. That's one of the considerations that Transport East is interested in. So we are a body that, I guess, advocates to central government for that wider infrastructure funding, mainly some of the big capital projects, so certainly West Anglia Main Line. We are wanting to work with local districts, though, on supporting the mechanisms behind delivery in local areas. We've done some work more widely with Essex County Council on the Housing Infrastructure Fund, for example. So it's probably one, as we develop our strategy over the next couple of months, that we're going to be looking at in that delivery section, because I agree that those are barriers. Moving on to your other point about electric vehicles, yes, the challenge is stark, isn't it? And I agree. At the minute, you would not be able to do what you can do in a petrol or diesel car, and the deadline the government have imposed is 2030 for the end of sale of those. Something has to happen quite drastically, as you say, both within the vehicle technology, but also the charging infrastructure. The vehicle technology itself, I mean, we and other STBs are, I guess, pushing the market as much as possible to develop those longer serving battery lives. What can we do at a local level to help accelerate that? I guess it's around the charging infrastructure itself. If you think at the trips that people might want to make in the future, if that is the alternative fuel we use, it would be great to roll out of charging points both at the home and also on street and also at destinations. Now, really difficult if you have a house or a flat that is not conducive to home charging. So some massive challenges there that I guess local authorities are going to have to tackle, as well as central government. But I think some really key issues there, Richard. Yeah, sorry, Alison, moving on to your questions. They relate strongly to levelling up from my point of view, and some of the issues you've identified there about social isolation, about the lack of accessibility by non-car modes, and the fact that people don't have access to computers, let alone the internet. I think this is all part of what we need to develop as our levelling up case in the east of England. The north of England and other parts have made a really strong case for investment on why they need investment in those types of areas. And I feel that we haven't made that case collectively as a region as well yet. But I think some of the issues you've articulated, if we could start to evidence those, if they come through our transport strategy strongly, we can certainly make the case for that to central government. I just don't think the east of England has yet articulated that case as well as other parts of England, but we need to do so to get investment in those areas. So I think, Angela, those are my key points on those.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Edward, we come to you next. Oh, you're on mute. We're all rusty after Christmas.
I am. Thank you very much, Angela. Yes, I mean, I'd just like to highlight a report I read by the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport called Better Planning, Better Places, Better Transport from about 18 months ago. The key message of that report is that development initially needs to be focused on where transport infrastructure and services already exist, and not on speculative infrastructure in remote locations. They assert very strongly that transport and development plans need to be aligned from the outset, and any transport systems that are going to be needed within the first 5 years of the plan ought to be close to implementation from the start. They shouldn't be an afterthought, as they all too often are. The reason we're in such a pickle now is the process of selecting sites for development has been driven by developers and landowners, with absolutely no thought given to any sustainable transport infrastructure. The train is by far our most sustainable form of transport, and electrification means that increasingly trains are powered by wind from the North Sea. So you can virtually sail your way into London and to Cambridge, which is wonderful. The busway from Huntingdon to Cambridge, although dated now, might also be an example of traffic-free, fast and sustainable travel that could be employed. Well, obviously it would be best if it was electric or hydrogen now. Much of our housing demand is driven by people whose jobs are in London, Cambridge or Addenbrooke's. So consideration of commuting journeys needs to be key to the reduction of our carbon footprint. At the moment, at least pre-COVID, most of them sit in traffic jams, polluting the air in Saffron Walden, going one way in the morning and coming back in the afternoon as they tried to get to and from Audley End Station. So I would dearly love to see a full review by experts on the scope for extending our railway and other transport systems, perhaps reversing some of the beaching cuts, and looking forward to a future where everyone who needs to commute to cities or towns can be within a 15-mile walk or cycle ride to an efficient train service. That's the sort of investment we need if we're going to build a zero carbon world and get the transport right in time for 2050. In terms of the slide you put up, my answer was yes to all the questions, some of which seem to be no-brainers. In terms of cycling, I cycle around as much as I can, and often to Audley End Station when we used to be able to go and travel around the world. But in terms of cycling, I guess it's most cost-effective to concentrate on towns first and get contraflows, cycling contraflows through our one-way systems, which would actually save me from hopping off my bike and either walking or scooting along little distances. Buses need to be much more frequent and affordable, electric or hydrogen powered. And as I think you said in your thing, Andrew, that we're ready for a radical rethink of our bus systems. I think we could be, in terms of walkers, we need to get rid of cars that think they have a right to park on pavements. You just think so often of, mothers wheeling buggies and people in wheelchairs who actually have to put themselves in danger and go out onto the road because they can't get along a pavement which has been parked on. But overall, I suspect that car ownership is going to be diminishing. I think the younger generation are going to be in a much less position, well placed to afford cars in the future than their parents were. And eventually, I think we're going to have robotic cars that just get summoned by an app, and therefore you don't have this ridiculous notion of owning a car that sits on your drive doing nothing for 90% of the time. So maybe we can actually start planning for diminishing car ownership as well as electric car ownership in the future.
Edward, thank you very much. Sorry, I need to jump in there just to make sure that if anyone else wants to make a comment that they can. Does anyone who hasn't spoken yet have anything they want to add to that? Ellen, I'm picking on you slightly. You don't have your hand up, but I know that you are somebody who probably you and many of your friends possibly have transport issues around Uttlesford in the days before you can drive. Is there anything you'd like to say about transport in Uttlesford at the moment? Edward's just been talking about young people in Uttlesford, and we have one right here. So
I think I mainly agree with what's been said already, really. That the current one just doesn't really seem to help. I mean, I have got the train and the bus before, but obviously you have to really plan ahead. And if you're just going for the day, when other people are calling their parents to pick them up and things, it can be quite it's much more difficult, isn't it, I suppose, to think about when the train comes in and make sure the bus is going to be there then. And you end up with like an awkward hour where you either just sit at the station or things like that. And I suppose in terms of the future, I think Edward's probably right that I expect people will, probably less people will have a car, especially I suppose if you do live in the city, then maybe if we do have more public transport, there will just be a less of a need for it. And what Andrew said about the new way of connecting with the internet instead, I think that's probably, I don't think it's going to replace transport at all, but I think it is, well, clearly with school, it's showing that it can do quite a lot. So.
Thanks very much. Thank you for that. Andrew, sorry, who was that?
It's me, Angela Anstey. I just wanted to come back on the matter of public transport and buses, because the Transport Forum heard recently from Essex County Council that they have been under severe pressure fund-wise to support the services that they've been required to put on during the pandemic, which effectively reflect the original timetables. And as a result of that, once all this is over, they will take a long, hard look at what services are sustainable. Now, seeing most of our buses don't run anything any closer than 1 hour together, in those circumstances, I hate to think what would happen if they were cut by half to 2 hours, as has happened on the Walden to Haverhill routes. They just won't be of any use to anybody.
Thank you for that. Andrew, do you want to come back on any of those points?
Yeah, there was a real theme there. I think particularly with Eleanor and Anthony around customer focus on buses, and the fact that the system isn't currently governed or coordinated to provide that emphasis on providing for what the customers need. I mean, I hate to use sort of the example of the difference in governance within London and outside of London because of national legislation, but within London, I guess there is an organisation that is responsible for a lot of modes of transport, and there is a governance position in place that sets out how customers receive data, how services coordinated. Eleanor talked about the link between trains and bus services, and the fact at the minute there's not coordination between them, whereas that could be a lot more effectively managed for the customer, as well as things such as provision of information about real-time data, etc. Frequency, as Anthony mentioned, also crucial. And it does feel that this is one of the things that as you develop your transport work, looking at how that might work in terms of the governance is crucial. Just going through some of those other issues as well. I think there was some discussion around particularly the mix of measures. And I think that there is a wide toolkit of measures that areas would need to use for this. Cycling was one we talked about. There was a focus on towns first suggested, which I'd probably agree with. I'll probably admit a personal interest here. My previous role was walking and cycling manager at Transport for London. So done quite a lot of work on cycling barriers. And it really is that safety issue that people are really concerned about. And so segregated provision, particularly in urban areas, as well as rural areas, is key. But to be able to make the business case to invest, I think I agree, it probably is towns probably have that business case. Not to say that rural areas also need to look at the opportunities going forwards. Car ownership diminishing is also an interesting point. And obviously something as we develop a strategy to 2050, have to start thinking about things such as automation and shared services as well. On the railway expansion, I think someone mentioned opening up closed lines. There is a government fund at the minute that is doing just that, and they have been inviting bids over the last year or so, and probably will do going forwards. I think it's called Reviving Our Railways, and they have been looking at opening lines across England, and a few local authority areas have been successful. So there is some thinking at central government on that, and it's probably worth looking into those details in a bit more if that's something that you'd want to pursue through your strategy. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Anybody that hasn't spoken? Janet.
Yes, I agree with things that have been said already. Just a few points. We've mentioned affordable housing, but also affordable transport. I don't think it's been mentioned yet. And what we do know is a lot of people who travel out of our area, or used to travel out of our area, used to travel out to higher paid jobs, and people who travelled in were in the lower paid area. So the affordability of whatever we put together, and we're looking at the moment about what can happen in the long term. And I think we ought to try and find a few short-term wins, especially on walking. And it's about getting people to their work and hoping their work, but also so that they can buy local. If we're going to get our economy working, we need to get much more local purchasing and local availability of services rather than travelling out for them, which then links into our skilled local workforce and our training and apprenticeships and young people, and getting the opportunities that are here for working and better connected and better known about.
Yeah. Janet, you're highlighting that thing about how transport links into everything there, I think.
Well, yeah, I know, and that's the trouble. I don't disagree with anything that's been said, but yeah. But I think we should get if we can get a few short-term things around walking, which links to the health. You know, sometimes our paths are just not good enough, and sometimes they're things that aren't quite as expensive as the big ideas. So if you can get a few smaller wins, you're taking people towards the larger agenda that will be working for
I
years.
completely agree, Janet. I can't even find a good way for people to walk from Saffron Walden to Saffron Hall at the moment. So
exactly.
I completely agree.
Unless you want to get very, very muddy, and so we could go into all weather footpaths with drainage.
Absolutely. Anyone else that hasn't spoken before I let Andrew speak about walking? Frank, okay. Any final comments, Andrew? Oh, Jackie, do you want to make a point?
I was just going to carry on from what Janet has just said in the sense of walking, but it seems all what we've said this evening, there's just not a lot of planning, or it doesn't feel like there's a great planning connection whereby you've got a brand new housing estate, like for example in Stansted, and then there's no cycle path or a decent walking path for all of those parents to not have to get into the car and go to the school. I just think there is such congestion around all of our communities in all of our towns every day when we go to school, when we don't have the pandemic, and we don't have simple wider paths or simple cycle paths, something that could be administered. And so therefore the smaller picture could be affected, and therefore 2 hours of a day, there isn't going to be so much travelling around in cars for those children to be delivered to school.
Thank you, Jackie. A thought on walking, Andrew?
Yeah, so walking is that overlooked mode of transport that actually is very important in the wider mix. So I think across the east of England, the last figures pre-COVID were 11% of trips made in the east of England were by walking, which is a lot when you think about the amount of trips. So obviously has a big potential. A lot of the customer research that's been done around walking different to cycling in terms of what the main barriers are to people. So with cycling, the big barrier that people talk about, half of people is safety. Whereas with walking, the big barrier that a lot of the research shows is that perception of lack of convenience, or people don't have time compared to using the private car, and the private car being a more convenient mode by perception. And that, I think that plays out in some of the comments from Jackie and Janet there in terms of, you know, people using cars to access schools for journeys that potentially could be walked in instead. So it leads into, okay, so what do you need to do to support that? And it is around making a more attractive urban environment for people to walking. I think Jackie mentioned some of the things you might do around footways, but also the information around walking, enabling people and inspiring people to walk more, giving that motivation to do so, and potentially putting some of those levers on the demand management side. Quite tricky often politically to do so, but is there a way you can put the balance towards people wanting to walk rather than use the private car for those local trips? Again, we go back to the conversation we had before about where do you put your housing. It's incredibly influential in whether people decide to walk or not ultimately in the future. If you're building communities where people have that, I think someone mentioned earlier, you know, that 15-minute community, a lot easier to walk than if you're building communities that are more dispersed across larger rural areas. So walking definitely an overlooked mode of travel, but with a lot of potential.
Great, thank you very much. So thank you so much, Andrew, for your presentation and for answering those questions so well. That was really, really interesting. I'm sorry we don't have time for more because there's so much on transport, there always is. So we're going to move on now. Perhaps if you could stay with us, Andrew, because what we're going to do is we're now going to do something we haven't done before, which is go back to a topic that we've previously discussed and talk about the summary of the consultation for that. And then we're going to come back to questions from the people watching the webinar on transport. So if you could stick around, actually some of the things on where you live are also include transport because it's in everything. So maybe quite interesting as well. So what happens now on transport is that the consultation document is going to go, is already on the UDC website. You can find it under the new local plan. And anybody from the panel or the public who makes comments, if they're received by the 10th of February on the website, they will be summarised by officers and discussed at the forum's meeting on the 24th of February. If you want to make comments and they're received after this date, they'll still be taken into account by officers when preparing the draft local plan. Hope that's all clear for everybody. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce Sarah and Joanna from UDC, who have been working on the summary of the consultation document for theme 1, where you live.
Thank you, Joanna. Hello everybody, I'm Sarah. I'm part of the planning policy team. So hopefully you'll have received, and members of the public will be able to find on the website along with the agenda, a summary of the comments we received in the 4 weeks following the discussion on the theme Where You Live. We've received 33 comments in that time, and for interest since then a further 5 comments have been received. By the nature of the questions asked, the responses were quite personal to where people live, but there were some comment points, and these have been picked up in the diagram. And it would be interesting to hear from you if you think any of these views are particularly pertinent, anything surprised you, or anything that you thought would be mentioned and hasn't been. And then we'll also take that summary and your thoughts following this discussion to our councillors on the local plan leadership group. And so finally, I'd just like to make a plea that if anybody seeing these comments has sparked a response to the questions, then encourage you to make your comments, and you have until mid-April to make them. So back to you, Angela, to see if anybody has any comments on that summary.
Thank you very much. So I hope you all had a chance to look at the summary of theme 1, Where You Live. There were some very strong themes coming through there, and many of the things that we discussed when we talked about Where You Live did then come through on the consultation, which was nice to see. Did anybody on this panel have any comments they wanted to make about that? Perhaps you could just raise your hand if you did want to make any comment about what came through on Where You Live. Anything from anybody? I mean, one thing that came strongly through, oh, Eleanor, go on, you go.
I do live on the edge of town, so maybe it's just where I live, but I was surprised that it says in Saffron Walden there's limited open space for leisure and need for more open space. I would have thought with the common and the Bridgeend Gardens, I feel like we have quite a lot of open space, especially with the fields around this area. But then again, maybe is there other parts of town maybe with less space? I'm just surprised by that.
Yes, that surprised me too, because I think one thing that Uttlesford does seem to have is a lot of open space, and it also came through to me that people were very attached to it, and that lots of people moved to this area because it's very rural. And so I think the speaker at the time was talking a lot about 15-minute communities where you were a 15-minute walk from most places you wanted to go, but that didn't seem to chime so much with the people that had commented because they'd moved to this area because it was rural and were a bit less interested in being in a 15-minute environment. I don't know if that came through to anybody else. Samantha?
I think I can see where they're coming from when they say that when people say that there isn't open space to use, because we and I live in Newport, we have fields around us, but in terms of open space that you can use and enjoy, it's a slightly different thing. It might be like in London, if you had access to a park or garden and it was a large area where you could learn to ride a bike or something. We lack that kind of amenity here, so I don't think we have enough open space. And also I see a problem with, well, which hasn't been maybe highlighted in the comments, was how we protect amenities which seem like open spaces but aren't. So we have a pub garden that we're about to lose or possibly lose through a planning application, and we can't really protect that, which is perceived locally as an amenity and an open space, but because developers have a lot of money to make planning applications and the local area doesn't really have a lot of money to fight them, we find we're often on the losing end of protecting amenity spaces that we love and enjoy. So it would be sad. It is a sad thing when we lose that kind of amenity space. And yes, I do think we have a lack of open space.
Thank you for that. Richard. Oh, you're on mute again.
Right. Yes, I think the first thing just is on that point about open space. I think Samantha is probably right there. There is lots of countryside to walk in. There are public gardens, particularly in Saffron Walden. But I think probably what people are thinking more in terms of is something like Hatfield Forest. I mean, Hatfield Forest is hugely overused, and the National Trust are seriously worried about it. And I think that probably there is a need for another large area of open space. I mean, we know Eastern Park has been proposed. I mean, it would be wonderful, but I think that is probably what people are thinking in terms of giving a new, very large open area to the public to enjoy, and perhaps take some of the pressure off Hatfield Forest. The other thing is, I think you just mentioned the 15-minute neighbourhoods, and I think this issue about whether it is appropriate to Uttlesford. I mean, the greatest proponent of 15-minute neighbourhoods at the moment is the Mayor of Paris, and the thinking that every arrondissement should have its own 15-minute community. That's fine. It works in a big city where you've got dense populations. You can have clusters of thousands of people, all within 15 minutes of their community facilities. I'm afraid it's not going to work in rural areas like Uttlesford. Most of the villages have not got anything like the requirement of the local population. Therefore, they have to drive to the bigger centres of Dunmow and Saffron Walden. So, I mean, I don't think the 15-minute community is going to work in planning terms, other than for a very large new community. So I think probably we need to stop talking about 15-minute communities. And I went through the notes prepared by officers, and I think probably all the comments are fairly predictable. I mean, some are conflicting, but I think they are fairly predictable. I think people are very proud of where they live in this area. I think everybody sees it as very much sort of a heritage area. And I think there's a great call for preservation, both of the countryside and of the rural communities. So I think that is what is coming through in this. And I think that's absolutely right that it should be coming through. So something for the forward planners to take on board.
Thank you, Richard. Samantha?
Yes, I feel strongly attached to the 15-minute community being a good thing if it reduces what's called urban sprawl. So, for instance, in our village, I'd like us to have barriers to endless development of our village that makes it a bigger and bigger place, because we do find that development on the edge of our community keeps expanding, and it does mean that people won't walk to the local shop. They'll get in the car and they'll drive, or they won't go to the local school by walking. They'll actually get in the car and drive, and that's why we do have this local rush hour. Even within Newport, people have to drive to get, for instance, to the primary schools. So I love the idea of the 15-minute community if it means that we have more services locally for people that are reachable and less urban sprawl, I think.
Thank you. So yes, there's sort of two things that we're not really opposing, I guess. I guess they can work in some areas of Uttlesford and don't need to work in others. But something for you to get your teeth into, Sarah. So I think what is going to happen now, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, is that you are going to present these key points. And probably it's worth me saying at this point that if anybody on the panel or the public feel that anything's been left out significantly of the summary that Sarah has published on the website, there is still a chance to go back and add additional comments at this point. There will be a presentation of key points to the local plan leadership group on the 8th of February. And then I believe there's another feedback to this forum on the 10th of February. Is that correct, Sarah?
So it will be the next one will have, I think, the next theme feeding back to it. I
see what you mean. Yes, sorry, I misread my notes. Yeah. Yes. Okay, fine. Thank you. So thank you for that. Thank you very much for that, Sarah. That's really good, and it's good to see how the process feeds back to us and how we feed back again. And I hope that was very useful for you. Now what we're going to do is we'll return to the subject of transport, and I'm going to introduce Ben Kennedy from UDC, who is going to take us through some of the more popular questions from the public on the Q&A. Ben, over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm actually from Essex County Council, not UDC. That's all right. I'm just going to read out the first question that's got the highest thumbs up. It's from Colin Day, who is a resident, not a councillor. He's put in brackets. He stated really that we need new housing standards on a national level. We're building new housing developments in the wrong locations that are totally reliant on private car travel. There's no rural bus service. So are cars the only way? It's hard to see a resolution to this issue without significant investment in public transport. That's the sort of statement question. Shall I carry on to the next one?
Yes, why don't you read out a couple and then we'll see if Andrew
so the next question is from Jeff Driscoll. He asks, what is the Transport East take on the current road network and future upgrades?
Okay.
And I will take one more from Richard Gilead. That he asks, is it realistic to expect transport infrastructure to be funded by developer contributions?
Okay, do you want to take any of those on, Andrew?
Yeah, I can make a start on those, and then happy for any others to sort of chip in as well. With the first one, I'm just reading it out on the screen as well. This does relate to some of the themes that we've been talking about earlier on. It sort of concludes with hard to see any other alternative to high car use except for if there was significant investment in public transport. And I think that goes back to the points in the discussion from earlier on around the model of transport, public transport provision in this part of England, and also the level of funding associated with that. It just feels that model is unsustainable, and the financial difficulties have been exacerbated by COVID. And over the next couple of years, if I mean, in the short term, if capacity restrictions due to COVID continue, but then in the long term, this issue around more dispersed housing settlements not supporting that type of passenger transport provision, you've both got a short and long term problem here. Some of the work that we're thinking about with government, and we're hoping that the government come through in their national bus strategy, is around new models of working, because I think something has to be done there. And that's probably something that you'd want to think about at a local level, and then also think about what you might want to advocate to central government in terms of the funding and the sort of the freedom and the governments that you have around that. Going back to the point that Eleanor made earlier on, actually, it's the linkage between different modes of travel is really important as well within that. So greater coordination. So there's definitely, I think Colin's right to raise that, and there's definitely some issues there, but some potential solutions that we need to look at here. In terms of Transport East's take on the current road network, I guess that's quite a broad question. We have published it's called an investment and delivery plan. The Transport Forum published this in November. It sets out amongst the local authorities within the East of England the top 30 road schemes top 30 schemes at a strategic level that the Transport East Partnership, including Essex and others, have identified as broad priorities for investment. There is a significant amount of road projects within that, particularly road projects that connect east-west, which I think is where some of the main connectivity challenges arise in this part of the world. I think, but also some of those north-south connections as well. Some projects related to this area are in there, such as the M11, A120 as well is included there. The issue there, I guess, is they are expensive, and government is being asked by all parts of England to fund road schemes, and so getting funding for those is very challenging, and you have to have a really good business case to stack up to make sure that you get that funding. I guess the challenge around roads is, I guess, the decarbonisation agenda. So as well as roads, it's working out along those corridors what is the rail connectivity as well. So again, projects such as the West Anglia Main Line, absolutely fundamental, particularly to this part of England, to make sure that you have that wider connectivity. Moving on to the third point, I'm just trying to remember what it was. Is it realistic to expect transport infrastructure to be funded by developer contributions? Well, it's probably a mix. It's difficult to get funding from central government, so whatever you can get at a local level, and working with developers to get as much as possible for those local improvements is key. Not only capital, but also, as we're talking about passenger transport, contributing to that longer term viability is going to be key. But it's working out how you can access different funding streams from central government. One of the challenges that Transport East is facing is the lack of connectivity between different central departments on funding. DFT, for example, with direct funding, but also MHELG for things such as a housing infrastructure fund. And part of the challenge for local authorities like this is working out how you maximise your contribution quite slickly from all of those and work them all together. A lot of challenges. I know Essex County Council have had a lot of challenges in trying to do that. But if you can get that right, it feels that there's a smart way to fund this stuff. If you're able to spend some time thinking about it. So Angela, that's probably my key points on those ones.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Brilliantly. It's just our job to dream on this forum. We don't have to worry about the funding. We can hand that all over to our colleagues at UDC to sort out. So brilliant. We probably have time for one more question, Ben, if you thought there was one on there that covered something we haven't covered already, or if you think we've covered it all, that's fine. Was there any more questions that you thought?
I'd just actually add to the developer contributions. I would say that there is recognition that all levels of government that it isn't ideal at the moment and hasn't necessarily been working as smoothly as it should have been, and the government has committed to looking at sort of an infrastructure levy, somewhat different to the community infrastructure levy in the white paper. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that. There is another question that's gone up in the votes, and it's from Richard, and it relates to many workers who travel in our area, are low paid, are more likely to work odd shift patterns, care, health and retail. And again, just emphasising the affordable, flexible transport is needed for them.
Okay. Great. Good. Does anybody have any last comment they wanted to make before we move away from transport? Frank?
Yeah, just one comment about transport in general. We know of the general concept of polluter pays. Well, surely that should be the same situation here with developers. Developers put a site in a place which isn't terribly well connected to the rest of the world. They should pay to connect it. They should be funding that, and as has already been commented in some areas, that just makes sense. They caused the problem, they should fix it.
Sounds good to me. Any other last comments before we move away? I'm sure we won't move away from transport because I think it comes up every week in some guise. If not, then thank you so much, Andrew. It's been really, really great to have you here this evening and hear all your thoughts on transport. It's such an important thing in Uttlesford, and we really appreciate your time in coming to talk to us. So just a reminder that please go onto the UDC website, make all your points and comments, whether you're a panelist or member of the public, about transport, and then we will get Sarah or somebody's summary of the conclusions of that discussion back here in a few weeks' time. So the upcoming theme on the 27th of January is leisure, culture and healthy lifestyles. And I think we do have a speaker lined up for this, not yet confirmed. And we will have some guest speakers as well on that. So please start thinking about your points and points for the people you represent regarding leisure, culture and healthy lifestyle. I think we're now on to any other business. Anything anyone would like to raise before we finish this evening? No, thank you, Andrew. Thank you, UDC officers, and thank you everybody for your time this evening. I look forward to seeing you all on the 27th of January. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.